Hi, everybody. As we get folks to join here, I see got a big crowd coming in. We're just going to wait another minute. Christy, I'm going to keep waiting because I see my numbers of participants keep growing. Okay. Hi. Welcome to our special webinar, our One Voice webinar. My name is Paul Nathanson, and I am with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. And I am here today with my colleague Omar Nashashibi from Inside Beltway. And as you know, there were a couple tariff announcements this week by President Trump. One about the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, and one about the reciprocal tariffs. And we are going to speak about that today. As I think all of you know, Omar at Inside Beltway does the advocacy for the Precision Metal Forming Association and the National Tooling and Machining Association. And Bracewell, my firm, does the strategic communications. We work very closely together. We've been representing NTMA and PMA for well over 10 years, maybe 15 years. And we're happy to be able to provide this special webinar to you today because we know there's a lot of concern with the president's announcements. So why don't we get right to it? As you see that the president announced let's start with the Section 232 steel and
Yeah,
aluminum.
just so maybe just a baseline is what we thought we might do here before we get into where we are today as of what the president just announced. Well, I was just thinking it'd be helpful to at least just set the baseline to know where we are, right? So there's a 25% tariff were imposed under the first Trump administration that he left in place. And so what you're seeing here was the initial list of the different items. And as we go through these slides, it's going to be important to know what these numbers are. You see 7208, 73, you'll see 76 when we talk about aluminum. Those are the chapter headings under the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States, the HTS of the US. Every single country in the world that ships a product has an HTS code for that product to the sixth degree number. And then it goes into the more and more detail down into those additional at the 8 and then 10 digit level. So when you're identifying a product for import and the tariff that's going to be applied to that import, the US government and all governments use a 6, 8, or a 10 digit number. That's what you're seeing here, and that's the baseline to give folks a little bit of a sense of where we started. 72%, or excuse me, 25% tariff on these products that are largely in Chapter 72 and Chapter 73. Chapter 72 are iron and steel. Chapter 73 are articles of iron and steel. Similar. At the time, though, he only put in a 10% aluminum tariff rate, and you'll see in here that's Chapter 76, and you see the forms of what he included initially at the time on that list of goods. The other articles that were outside of the traditional that you'd consider are these castings and forgings of aluminum. But Paul, I think to your point here, going back to setting, now bringing us here, fast forward to the president's announcement and where the media is, we just thought it'd be helpful at least set the baseline on what first happened before we get into going what's going on. Because yes, Paul, this is all over the media right now.
Right. And I mean, so we'll get into what happened, but just to demonstrate that we're already in the news media as far as expressing concerns about the action that the president took. We'll talk about a little bit later that there's been a deafening silence in Washington, really, among major steel and aluminum users right now. And that's because the president tends to make announcements and then they put out these then they put it in the register based on a tweet or something. Then they create the policy, and then there is room for negotiation. I'm not saying that that's going to happen in this case, but it's interesting how a lot of the associations and major steel and aluminum users have been pretty muted in their response, and we can talk about that a little later, Omar.
Yep, agreed. So I appreciate that. Just wanted to at least again set the baseline from where we were 2017-18 to the fast forward for the announcements that you saw that shattered quite a bit. I was on the Hill on Tuesday as these executive orders and proclamations rather started coming through. All right, let's just get right into it now. We're going to run through as usual. These slides are going to be sent out. There's a recording going to be made. Please do type in your questions into the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer those as we go if they're on topic on the slide that we're going on. If not, we will continue to go through and add them onto the end when you'll be able to just type it in again into that Q&A box. All right, on February 10th and then in just past midnight on February 11th, we did get the official proclamations from the White House related to steel and aluminum. A quick summary of what the president did and is right here, the who, what, where, why, when, how. All countries. So that's why we wanted to go back and establish the baseline that we showed you on that previous slide on steel and aluminum in 2018. These are all countries. There is no Canada exemption, no Mexico exception, no EU, no Japan, no South Korea absolute quota, no Brazil absolute quota, no exceptions for Australia. As of right now, if they were to take effect, which they don't until March 12th, there would be total tariffs on all steel and aluminum under those HTS codes that they've put forward. It's a 25% rate, so that has not changed on steel. However, it is an increase from the 10% rate on aluminum to a 25% rate. There will be no exclusion process on these tariffs, no country exceptions, and no tariff rate quotas. To step back for a second, countries receive exceptions, that's what Australia received, or they received quotas, such as the South Koreans on absolute or the EU on the tariff rate quotas. But then there was an exclusion process that allowed the steel importer such or aluminum, such as yourselves or a service center, to request the relief to not pay the tariffs. I was told by a U.S. Senator on Tuesday afternoon, point blank, three of us in the room, there will not be an exclusion process, is what the Secretary of Commerce nominee told them sitting on that same couch we were on. So that's just a heads up of what to see, and we'll go through that in more detail. The when this takes effect, again, there's still time for negotiations. 12:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on March 12th, 2025. And again, all the exclusions, all those disappear, tariff rate quotas, all those terminated on March 12th. We'll get into more details on that. The exclusion process itself is already closed. And again, we're doing this under the national security process there. And keep in mind, under the general application of these tariffs and how they are. These are, if you're importing metal from China, which, I mean, again, that's questionable what you're doing there. That's a 60% steel tariff right now coming in from China if you are importing steel directly from there. As you can see, it's a combined rate. We covered last week the new Section 301 tariff. That's a combined 25% base plus the new 10%. Add to that the 25% of the new 232 action and starting on March 12th at 12:01 a.m. Steel and now aluminum coming in from China into the United States would be subject to a 60% rate. But again, a reminder, we've always had a 25% rate that's been in place on the 232 since Trump came into effect, and that's always been compounded in addition, combined with the 301 action and with any other general duty rates that are out there. So again, just one more time on the slides here, and you have it in one space. We are starting on March 12th at 12:01 a.m., having steel and aluminum on tariffs coming in. Starting at that time, there is no exclusion process to apply for relief from paying those tariffs, no country exceptions. They may expand the list to cover some steel and aluminum derivatives. And that is one of the questions that just came in. Is the tariff only on raw materials, or does it include metal machine components? And this is captures this exactly correct. If it's only the raw material, it makes the U.S. less competitive on machine components. And that's exactly what we saw happen. I know Paul's going to speak to that in a little bit as well. We saw that in 2001. We saw that in 2017 and 18. So that's exactly right. Just at 11:35 today, they did release the derivatives list, and it is not nearly comprehensive and does not cover machine components. Based on the read, we'll get down to that in a few slides here as well. Just a quick heads up on the timeline. This is moving pretty quickly here in that we are going to see some additional movement. President announces something, to Paul's point, and they move pretty quickly on that. But Paul, I think let's go to one of the main reasons that they did this. You remember Wilbur Ross back in 2017 talking about that arbitrary 80% capacity utilization rate. So on this in the next two or three slides, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so the whole purpose, as the way that these tariffs were first put in place was under Section 232 back in 2018. And in order to place these tariffs, the Commerce Department had to do a study that would show that imports of steel and aluminum are a national security threat to the U.S. And what the Commerce Department came up with and the Trump administration came up with is that the domestic steel industry, U.S. steel producers, must have a capacity utilization rate of 80%, and that imports of steel, imports of steel and aluminum have negatively impacted the capacity utilization rate, and the increase in imports have threatened the U.S. security. And remember the percentage that they base this on is this 80%. Why is it 80%? That is a number they determined. There really isn't anything behind that 80%, except that somebody decided that 80% should be the proper capacity utilization rate. The proclamation that was signed, again, said that there must be a sustained production capacity utilization rate of at least 80%. So what is the utilization rate? It has been over the last 6 years. It's really hovered, and for briefly, it was above 80% right after the tariffs were announced. Here is a graph that shows that 80% line and where it has been. Obviously, the big dip happened during COVID, and where all production really tanked. And then it shot back in 2021. And it has been fairly close within 5 to 8% of 80% over the past 3 years, briefly reaching above 80% in 2024. So right now it's hovering at, I think, Omar, it's what, 75, 76%.
Yeah, it's the weekly from AISI.
Yeah. So, but that is the reasoning that the administration has given, and it's the same reasoning that was in the original report that the Commerce Department gave to President Trump back in 2018, and that he used when he announced these tariffs in March 2018. And I just want to go back. Well, I just want to emphasize that President Biden kept these tariffs by and large, except that he made deals with the European Union, Japan, and the UK to replace the tariffs with tariff rate quotas, where you could import a certain amount of product before and when that quota is full, then the tariffs were applied. That is all gone. And one of the reasons that President Biden negotiated that deal with the EU is because they have a list of retaliatory tariffs that they were about to implement, and you are likely to see that rise up again. They had tried to negotiate some other deal, long-term deal on that would replace tariff rate quotas. Remember the Green Steel Club that President Biden was promoting, where they would base it on emission standards of where the steel was from, targeting China really. But that deal was never made, and they just simply extended the tariff rate quotas, which, Omar, I believe that deal was going to expire with the EU in March anyway. And now that has been done away with. Australia, for reasons that I'm still trying to figure out, back in 2018, had a full exemption from these steel tariffs. And that has gone now that they are going to get 25% tariff. Ukraine was exempted after the war. That is gone. And then a couple countries had hard quotas, Korea and Brazil. They now have 25% tariffs.
Yeah. I agree. And so it kind of comes back to, Paul, I think the point you made, this didn't work the first time around. What does it make them think is going to work this time on the 80%? Or if it did work, then why are we adding more? To the question that we just received, since we're on the capacity utilization rate, who is responsible for reporting capacity utilization? There's an official government number that's done by the census, but the numbers that are reported here are industry, and it's the raw steel tonnage that is provided. It's an estimate, of course, but it's compiled by the weekly production tonnage provided by approximately half of the domestic production capacity. I'm reading from the AISI's website. So it's the American Iron and Steel Institute production report. They've been publishing this for decades. So it is generally one that folks around town are using. But again, obviously it fluctuates and it may not necessarily be the exact material that we need. It just might be the ones that they're choosing to make. And that's some of the challenges that we've got there. A few other things that we do want to make here on some points before we get more into the details here. The exclusion portal is closed. And that means that your portal where that would allow you to have gone and seek relief from having to pay those tariffs, you no longer have access to submit that request. As a reminder, when the White House the first time around imposed these tariffs, they created a process that does allow you to petition the government to request to not have to pay the tariff through an exclusion. The steel industry could file an objection to that exclusion, which they did with regularity, and they succeeded more often than not, especially after a while. Then that exclusion would expire after a certain time. You no longer have the ability to request an exclusion, so that is closed. What shall happen now is the secretary shall not, means commerce secretary throughout here, shall not consider any product exclusion requests or renew any product exclusion requests that are in effect as of that date. So that means they are shutting down that process. Please note, the secretary shall terminate all existing general approved exclusions as of March 12, 2025. Those are the GAES that were implemented under the previous administration to allow for a across the board with regards to importation of basically if there were no objections, they would just grant it. Anybody could that was using the material didn't have to apply on their own. And it's to simplify the process. And it actually did help in some cases, but really was not really theirs. But otherwise, any exclusion that has been granted on the product shall remain effective until the expiration or until the excluded product volume is imported. That means the tariff rate quota system. But effectively, you want to treat this as everything is shut down by March 12th for large purposes there as you look at it. The country exemptions, remember, exclusions are for products, exemptions are for countries. The country exemption will terminate on 3-12, and those will include all of the tariff rate quotas that Paul was referring to and the absolute quotas, in addition to the exception that was granted to Australia on the aluminum side. You'll see the countries here: Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, EU, all 27, plus UK, Japan, Mexico, and South Korea are all now eliminated from that, starting on there as well. A question that we just received, and we will speak to this right now: exclusion termination. Is it only for steel and aluminum under Section 232? That is correct. Everything we are covering today is only and exclusively to the Section 232 steel and aluminum action. It is unclear about whether or not the president will allow for an exclusion process on China. It is still unclear at this point in Hill meetings. The general sense was senior folks on the Hill were being told no. But at the same time, many of those believe that once there's a certain amount of pain on consumers, there might actually be, because for the first time on the China side, he's putting a 10% tariff on products that were never, ever subject to a tariff at all. And a lot of those are electronic and consumer facing goods. So there might be a chance on that side. But to the person's question, exclusion is terminated for steel and aluminum. It's unclear if they will restart an exclusion process on China 301, which is not currently open. And of course, on this one, they addressed Ukraine along with the other countries that are there. We received another. Go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, Omar, one thing on also on exemptions, as folks will recall, back in 2018 for the first 3 months, about Mexico and Canada were included as for 25% tariffs, and then they threatened retaliation, and under USMCA there were negotiations, and they were exempted from the 232 tariffs. But now that is gone. Like it includes every country, including Mexico and Canada. Thanks, Omar.
Thank you, because that's exactly right. This is the issue that's been going on. Countries that had the exception, because they look at the trade relationship that are there, that's what hit a lot of folks with shock, in addition to obviously the movement of goods across the border under the February 1st announcement. So that is very significant. I appreciate you pointing that out, that they had something that they lost, and that's what doubles down the attack on Canada and Mexico, in addition to the obvious target of China that's out there. We did receive a question on duty drawback, and the answer is no. Duty drawback shall not be available under steel and aluminum tariffs. In fact, under the 232s, they did not allow for duty drawback under the 232s. They did allow for duty drawback under the Section 301s when they first put them out there. However, under the most recent action from February that took effect February 4th, 12:01 a.m., there is no duty drawback on the additional 10%. A reminder here, duty drawback is the refund of certain duties. Basically, when you bring in a product and then you're going to export it back out, you don't have to pay the duties or the tariffs. In this case, you will have to pay the duties or tariffs, even if that steel or aluminum is coming in for purposes of destruction or for export. But again, that remains the same that's there. Paul, you want to jump in here too? When they do start talking about the covered steel and some of the downstream products, it's not necessarily what we all think of it to be.
No, there was a very so back in 2020, President President the president changed and included some downstream steel derivative products to be included in the 25% tariffs on steel and the 10% tariffs on aluminum. But it was a very narrow list of products that did not include the products that I believe most of the folks on this webinar include. But the both in aluminum and steel. But the president, in his announcement last week, has said that there will be derivative products included, both steel and aluminum, and that when the president announced this a few days ago, he said that it's set out in Annex 1 of this proclamation. So we all got the proclamation. Omar and his team and myself and our researchers all went to the proclamation, and there was no Annex 1. So we were all kept in dark until about just about 50 minutes ago. They came out with the annex of derivative products, and I know, Omar, you're going through that right now and seeing what the list is. As you said, it's not a robust list, but they also announced a process where you can apply for for the derivative product, to add your derivative product. But Omar, I know you'll get into that as well.
Yeah, and so we still are, and we've got a few slides on what some of that means here on the next one, but we did just want to flag that what the steel folks here also on some of the mini mills, in that there's no derivative on, or excuse me, no tariff on that derivative that's melted and poured in the U.S. So if they're looking at steel that was originally melted and poured in the U.S., but then might go overseas for some other further working, and then they'll come back for the steel industry to reuse it, they're not going to put a tariff on that as well. So that's something that they flagged in there. All right, so what is listed on Annex 1, as Paul mentioned, we literally just got this. And so at 11:52, we deleted the slide that said what is in Annex 1 and just copied and pasted this. These are the HTS codes. For what it's worth in here, this is going to be published on Monday, but you'll notice, what did I point out early on what chapter 72 and 73? This is it, folks. This is Annex 1. This is what they're considering as being derivative products. This is not it. This is not going to cover you all. It's not going to cover 99% of users of steel and aluminum. They did not go that broadly. We'd been in touch with the White House folks on Tuesday on this, was in touch with the U.S. Trade Representative at 4:30 yesterday on this as well, and submitted the list of that we believe are a comprehensive list as well, and this is nowhere close. If you'll take a look at, they're largely stay in the articles of iron and steel, and those are the ones that the steel industry themselves put out there. You're going to see the ones that are over on Chapter 84. Those are machinery. A couple of those, one is for elevator shafts. Literally, that's what 8431 is related to elevators. 8432 is related to agricultural machinery, one item. And you'll see, so two lines. So they dedicated one whole section in 8431 to elevator shafts and the other one to agriculture vehicles. So not a whole lot there. To Paul's point, it does still provide that there's an opportunity though, to go in and apply to have it extended beyond that. And you'll see here, it's similarly not exactly a comprehensive list of derivative products when you get into the aluminum side of this either. Many of them are still remaining under Chapter 76, which is where many of them were before. And then again, Chapters 84 is under machinery that's there. And that's kind of where they ended up. And this literally just put down, so we have not obviously translated this into into English for you. I think on the aluminum one, looking at these numbers, for those of you that are using aluminum, there is actually a decent chance that some of these might actually be products that you make. There are some fittings in here. There are some couplings. There are some machinery items that do fall into 80, 84, but some of the fittings and some of those fasteners might be under Chapter 83. And then I also think you might have something under an 87, 85. So there might be a few that were added under here, but on the aluminum side. But no, again, vast majority, this is still a steel and aluminum tariff is what it is. They said that within 90 days, they are going to put out a process for us and others to be able to apply. And what they have said is for products that are come outside of Chapter 73 that we'll talk about on the next slide, they're going to have a tariff on that product. So tariffs will only apply to the steel in the derivative article. So they're going even further on here. And that's where they're saying that they only want the tariff to apply only to that to the steel within that component that comes in within that HTS code. And CBP is the Customs and Border Patrol that's going to come out and put out some more implementation information on this. Our understanding is that's supposed to happen by March 10th. I think by March 10th. So that should happen here pretty relatively quickly ahead of some of the additional deadlines that are on here. The tariff again only applies to the steel within that derivative. And so for any derivative steel article that's identified in Annex 1 that is not in Chapter 73. So if you're on steel and we saw something that popped up in Chapters 84, 85, 99, I think were the other three chapters that were listed in there. And let's say you've got a plastic attached to it, or it's been further worked in some other ways with a non-steel product than material, then you're not going to have tariff relief on that. So some of you now are starting to calculate how the complicating factors are of this and the declared value and the contents within the material, and that's going to add another layer there. So maybe I should have put this earlier, but just to give it to sense to you, this is Chapter 73, just to put it in a little bit more of words for you and what you saw in those numbers back there on 7318. So there's where you could have some other items that could be screws and bolts. These are what they call articles of steel that are in there, but they get specific. So even in some of these areas, you might have some of the stamped articles of iron and steel covered to protect some of your products, but it may not be for everybody. Example, the automotive stampings are not included in this, but suspect that for some of you all, that's going to be one of those that we will be submitting a request to have that expanded. So just give you a sense of what they look like. If you ever want to go take a look at HTS codes, they fall under the ITC link that's down there below. And they did the same thing over on the aluminum side. The aluminum, the tariff relief would only apply to the aluminum within that derivative there as well. And again, that's Chapter 76 and where that falls down here. A few more, and we'll start getting ready to take any live questions in about 7 or 8 minutes here, probably closer to 12:40 in about 10 minutes. A few things just to note that on the Russia side, there's additional in this one. We talked to some folks on the Hill about this, how they're seeing from overseas Russian aluminum still being used primarily and especially in aerospace industries by India and others. And then you're seeing that component coming into the United States. This would put a 200% tariff rate on even derivatives of any of those articles that are coming in there. So that's another way to try to address that as well. Again, there's going to be a process to expand that derivatives list, and that's where we obviously, on behalf of industry, will be seeking relief and trying to further explain to this administration as we did the first time. And the thing is, in their proclamations, Paul, I do know that they very much reference the downstreams and the injury that was caused to the downstream. So he said it in his notice that he came out with on Monday. on Tuesday rather, but they didn't entirely reflect that in the actions that his staff put out there as well. So there is going to be a process for including additional derivative steel articles at the request of a producer of a steel article or derivative steel article or an industry association representing one or more such producers where the request establishes that imports of a derivative steel article have increased in a manner that threatens to impair the national security. We obviously and certainly and plan on making that argument repeatedly with them in those filings, and certainly that they've given standing to associations, Paul. I think that's a good opportunity. At least they gave us an opening there.
Yeah, I do think it is an opening for because they added industry associations. This is going to be an entirely new process, right, Omar? So they have to put this together as quickly as possible, and then they are supposed to respond within 60 days of receiving the request. If I would expect that the number of requests that they receive is going to be of a large volume. And if we have, as history can be a lesson, when they open the exclusion process later in 2018, they were overwhelmed with requests, and it was not 60 days. Sometimes it was almost a year. Isn't that right, Omar?
That's right.
Yeah.
I think that this is going to be a competitive process, and that's why, thankfully, we've got in early with the White House. We got in early with the USTR. Like I said, was on the Hill 2 days this week, 1 day last week, dealing with folks on this, and yeah, this is going to be a process to see how they get this up and running and do this in a legitimate way. But again, the fact they gave us standing, and also I think that we have each association has done a good job. Both Klotz and his predecessor and Roger Atkins have done a good job working with the steel industry and some of their counterparts at the different trade associations. And we're going to need to work with I hate to say it, but work with the steel industry, I would think, Paul, and Aluminum Association as well, to make sure that they don't object, because it should be in their interest to have their customers' product protected. And in the case of many of you all, you are 100% their metal, and that's something to take a look at. So the precedent from last time around on what they did, Paul referenced this on the derivatives list for steel. What President Trump did at the time, he did expand it a little. Paul, I remember the Missouri nail guy that kept on going there.
Yes, there was a gentleman in Missouri who wound up on national media, and I think that in response that Nails got on that list, right, Omar?
Yeah, that was then, and I think it's a little bit different now versus that as well.
Yes.
So you'll just get a sense of how he did expand it, but kind of narrowly, and you'll take a look at just some of those in there that they did. He did, of course, we mentioned this, did include bumper stampings of steel, and you'll see that's under Chapter 87. 87 is automotive and some other vehicles that are in, and you'll take a look at that what Chapter 87 was, and that was included the first time around, and you'll get a sense of what they might do expanded. So there is precedent for this, and that's why we do believe that things are, as we say, less bad than they were the first time around. But this is certainly very, very serious, particularly with imposing tariffs on our allies, as is the potential. Again, this is all potential. We still have some time there. Again, there is going to be that process, but you cannot apply for the full value. So that means that if you are bringing in a component, or a competitor, your potential customer is bringing in something that we get on that list. So that's something to work through that. Again, no, there's a lot to digest. I know quite a bit of this is shocking, but we also know that we still have some time. I mean, I don't want to overly speculate before we pivot to the reciprocal trade and tariffs for related to EU and others, but there's still some time. But I mean, Paul, there's going to be tariffs on steel starting on March 12th. The question is, and aluminum, and the question is on whom. I think that's really where we're going with it in the end.
Yeah, I think this is very different than the president's announcement on these tariffs on Mexico and Canada, unless they stop drugs and immigrants from coming over the border, which, there was a negotiation. I think the 25% tariffs on aluminum steel are coming. Um, I think the somewhat muted reaction by a lot of the steel and metal using trade associations that represent large companies, and many of your customers indicates that right now the strategy that most are employing is to see what is going to happen with the reaction from our foreign trade partners and the threats of retaliation, and also getting in there. As Omar indicated, he was one of the first in there to see about these derivative products, and then doing it's a very different strategy than what happened in 2018. And then on top of that, a couple days later, which the president hinted at when he announced the Section 232 tariffs, he announced these reciprocal trade and tariffs, Omar.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I appreciate that segue that you set up really well, but I am going to pause because we did get one question on the steel and aluminum side.
It was
Do
a
you think the
perfect segue,
I
Omar.
know it was, and I don't mean to crush your flow,
All right.
but because I do want to encourage folks to type in more questions as we're getting ready, since we've started or haven't really come in here in about 15 minutes. I do think the items that made the derivatives list were politically motivated exceptions. To be honest, no, I don't. If there were more than what's on there, I'd argue yes, but it seems fairly limited to the standard AISI and aluminum, at least on the steel side. No, I don't think so. If I thought it was more politically motivated, we'd see a lot more random items that were added and attached on there. But I mean, to Paul's point, there's still a lot of moving targets with regards to the steel and aluminum process. Again, we do believe that there will be tariffs coming. There will be a process to expand for the derivatives. We will be involved in that process as he's got a lot. I mean, he's moving forward with the shock and awe strategy. We talked to Canadian manufacturers that are just besides themselves over this 51st state thing, which we just keep telling them, get over it. That's 49 electoral college votes Republicans don't want to risk. Reciprocal tariff actions. This is another one of those areas where the president is threatening action that is not quite there yet. This is a very, very complicated effort that he is undertaking. Let me step back and put this in English. What the president is instructing his staff to do is to go around the world and identify every instance where they impose a tariff on the United States, a duty on the United States, a value added tax on products going from the United States, a discrimination on regulatory standards against the United States, wage suppression against employees from the United States. You see where I'm going with this list? This is a long list imposing unfair or limited market access or any other structural impediment to fair competition. The president wants to impose reciprocal tariffs, including on the value added list, what a value added tax. What he's looking at doing in this area he wants a report due from all of his major agencies due by April 1st. The Secretary of Treasury has said that the new duty or tariff rates could go into effect as soon as as soon as April 1st, April 2nd, rather. He told us April 2nd the other day, or at least he told a member of Congress that told us that. So that's where they're looking at. So they need to receive a memo back to the White House from the different agencies that are going to outline all the different areas with the non-reciprocal trade agreements that are adopted by trading partners. And then he's going to start imposing these duties and these tariffs. It is going to be complicated because not only will it vary by country, it will vary by product. And that's where we've got the area to get a better understanding of what those goods coming in by country. I mean, it varies. So you have to look at that chart that I gave you on schedules 1 and 2, and then you saw the different small percentages, 2.5, 3.5. That's exactly what it is. It's going to be at that level. This is going to, customs brokers are going to make a lot of hand over fist in this area as well. So that's something to take a look at. Again, the reciprocal tariff report is going to be due, and then within 180 days, they're going to assess the fiscal impacts. So, as somebody from the South said to me yesterday, they're fixing to do something, and that's similar to kind of seems like what they're going to do here. They're not applying tariffs right away, but the soonest that the Secretary of Treasury said that they could is going to be on April 2nd. But on some other issues, they're still holding out. So this could be a rolling process of applying additional tariffs and duties over a matter of months throughout the year until he receives what he wants, which we really don't know what that could be. And then, of course, he's going to retaliate. And then again, here how you see the non-tariff barrier, the value-added tax, and some of those definitions there. We do have a few questions that have come in. We're going to go ahead and now open it up for any questions. I know we may have created more that are out there. We don't have obviously information on what an exclusion process would look, exclusion, but on a derivative expansion process rather would look like. That's certainly not just top of mind, but we plan on influencing that process immediately. We don't have a Secretary of Commerce yet, but we do have, we've been in good contact with the folks over at the Commerce, excuse me, the White House and the National Economic Council and the U.S. Trade Representative all this week. And so we'll be working with those folks there. A couple of things that are coming out. If a home use product is made from steel or aluminum in China and the final part is imported to the US and sold to the US customer, will there be a tariff on these items? There would be a tariff on the item under the 301 tariff action plus the additional. So there would be a 35% tariff most likely, or there would be one of three levels. You'd be either at 10%, meaning there was never a tariff on it before. There would be then a 17.5% tariff. That means it was on list 4A. It was one of 3,200 imports. Or if it's one of 6,800 imports and it's on list 1, 2, or 3, that product would then be subject to a 35% tariff. Other goods that are coming in under this 232 action, no. If they do not appear under those chapters that are identified of 72, 73, and then 76 for aluminum and some of the others, they would not, because that product is tech that's coming into the United States is not an article of steel or iron under Chapter 73, nor is it steel or iron under 72 or aluminum under 76. It's likely a different product, whether it's a toy, whether it's for a barbershop, you name it, it would come in under something separate that's there. What derivatives do the PMA and NTMA plan to submit? How do we find out if our products might be included on any derivatives request? That's an excellent point. What we've built over the years is a comprehensive list that matches up HTS codes with the NAICS codes that are out there. It's an Excel spreadsheet that we maintain. For example, when you go look at it and it says the word stamping, that only appears in a handful of places. So what we've done is we've gone even further out, and our research staff over the years has built a list that goes through the HTS codes and says that even if it does not include the word stamped, and if it's not in the automotive chapter of 87, that this likely is also a stamped product. And so we've gone through and created that list. On the NTMA side, there's six NAICS codes, I want to say. It might be seven. If Laura, if you're on here, you can correct me. But what that does, it goes everything from the dies, the jigs, and all those, all the way over to machine shops and takes your NAICS codes and then pulls all the corresponding HTS codes that the US government has had. So what we might do is we'll talk to staff at each association and see if we can put that up for a comment place. And maybe if nothing else, just to see how many think that they'd fall into each of those categories. We would not take any off of our master list unless I am told to. Our plan is to keep them all onto that list because we want to cast a broader and wider net. But I appreciate that question. We'll talk through here over the next few days how we can get that done there as well. Uh, another question, similar to the related one. Am I understanding it correctly that if we purchase a completed part from overseas that has stamped steel component, the value of the steel is subject to the tariff? It depends on how it comes into the United States. What they are talking about is a derivative. If they expand the product derivative list to include the component that you just mentioned in that example. So let's answer this more completely. If they do expand the derivative product list to cover that stamped steel component you just mentioned, then the steel within that stamped component, yes, would be subject to a 25% tariff if it appears on the derivatives list. So it's a two-parter that you'd have to achieve the protection. The protection would not apply to the value of the good outside of the steel if the product does not appear in Chapter 72. If you have an automotive stamping that's under 87, then your Chapter 87 product, then the value of the steel within that coming in, the customer would have to pay the tariff on the value of the steel if it's expanded to be included on the derivative. If it is not expanded and included on the derivative product, then no, then it is as it is today and has it been since W. Bush and then again since Trump. There's a tariff on the steel, but not on the more finished product, which is exactly our concern that we brought up there as well. And again, if there's follow-ups on any of those, please type in the follow-up and I'll double back to those questions and add any further clarification or color as we can. We've still got 14 minutes, plenty of time to keep going. Please type in more. Appreciate them coming in. How will the tariff be applied on a product that is shipped to Canada for some type of process or plating and then returned to the US? For example, coil steel shipped to Canada, then rolled into a tube and returned to the United States. That will fall back, I believe, under the melted and poured. Again, disclaimer, not a trade attorney. If the steel itself is melted and poured in the United States and it travels up to Canada for treatment and comes back down, the language as if you read it as written would indicate that a tariff would not apply to that steel article that is moving across the border. If that article, though, is further substantially transformed and now is a part or a component that falls out of the covered chapters of 72, 73, 76, or the derivative products, then it would in fact be subject to the 25% tariff as it travels back in. And keep in mind, you still have hanging over you the March 4th deadline for the tariffs to potentially be reapplied or applied on Canada and Mexico that have been suspended. So that's a 25% there, then add on the 25% from the steel and aluminum, and that's potentially a 50% tariff rate starting on March 12th if there's no agreement by March 4th on the underlying action under the IEPA combined with the 232 that's out there as well. Any word, oh, this is a good one too. Any word on tariffs being placed on copper? Today, there was a 40-cent spread between the LME, the London Metal Markets Exchange, and the COMEX. And the thought is, could it be copper tariffs are coming? Are you hearing anything about them? I absolutely 100% am hearing yes on copper. What the president has done is he's requested that by April 1st, that the USTR, Commerce, DOD, Treasury, and one other doesn't matter. They would need to come back to the president with recommendations for additional Section 232 tariff actions for restrictions on imports. I'm hearing copper. I heard rare earth critical minerals. One more. Not your industry, so it doesn't matter, but there's three that they're talking about. And copper is absolutely one of those that they're talking about launching a Section 232 national security investigation into that one as well. Happy to follow up on that with those because we did 3 years ago. I can't remember, Paul, if it was pre or post pandemic. It might have been just after pandemic. There was a big copper issue. I know we weighed in with some folks on there. I don't know if you remember.
We did. And that process, Omar, would be a whole, you would have to start the process, have a commerce investigation, and then a report, and then sent to the president, correct?
Correct. That is exactly correct. That's an investigatory process. They would have to issue a finding from the Department of Commerce that would go over to the Secretary of Defense for concurrence or ignoring, and then over to the White House to act on recommendation. So on the copper side, you are definitely looking at a process is not weeks, that is months. Circling back as a follow-up, would the tariff be applied to the value add of the work only that is related to the Canada side of it? The question on the coil going back and forth on Canada. Again, not a broker or a trade attorney. It's my understanding it would be on the declared value of the product as it comes in, if it is not covered by a exception for that product to come back and forth under the melted and poured. So typically it would be on the declared value, not on the value added. So it's not a VAT, it is a flat tax or a tariff, so to speak, on there. Next one, we're getting to some service center questions. Some service centers have suggested for administrative convenience, they'll apply the new tariff rates on materials to be sold to the fabricators on a D-Day approach. Even on imported materials they already hold on hand in US prior to tariff announcement. Is it fair or is it legal? Definitely not touching the back end of that question. There are attorneys that can certainly speak to that. I will already speak, and Paul, jump back in. It was Tuesday, was it Tita last Tuesday that did it in the journal? It was in the B section talking about how steel prices were already, or steel producers rather, were going to start increasing prices.
Right. I think Bob Tita is one of the reporters who gets it, and his whole story was on how, you know, obviously tariffs. The purpose of a tariff is to protect the industry, the product, and the producers who are making that product in the United States, so that they can raise prices, and that's the impact. We have said that the concerns of PMA and many PMA and NTMA members are that they only purchase products their steel and aluminum products from U.S. Producers. But when there is not imports, and because the steel industry produces only 75 to 80% of the what is demanded in this market, they have unlimited pricing power, and that's when the gap between what you all pay for your steel and aluminum and what your global competitors pay widens, and that creates problems. And I guess, Omar, that this proclamation tries to get at that by opening up this derivatives process, so that these downstream products can be protected as well.
Yeah, that's that's exactly right. As they look through that process going there, we've got a few more questions that came in. I think one's on painting and coating and treating. The way to look at this is typically to by HTS code. I'm not trying to fall back and get out of it, but you really are going to want to look at it. Typically, the painting and coating does not change the form or function. If you're doing some heat treating or annealing or something like that, yeah, you might be. But if it's a, especially if it's a cosmetic or if it's potentially just to keep it for rust proofing, I shouldn't say it again, not a lawyer, doesn't typically change the form or shape or function. So you're going to want to always fall back on the HTS code when looking at that and where it might be impacted. Sorry, grabbing my other computer to answer the other question that came in. We had one question that came about how many potential items could be listed on for the derivatives. Let's see. So on machine tools, it starts on line 4 under chapter 84 for machine tools. That entry line is 213 HTS codes. So metalworking machinery for grinding. So that's how that one would look. And that's just one of the categories that would look there for the stampers. You've got a number because you fall under 83 as well as obviously 73. You've got a 76 for your aluminum stampers that are in there. The stampers tend to be 92 is the longest of the list that we've got on there to answer that HTS question that came up there. A few others that are on there is the tariff on aluminum castings from China only to be applied to the aluminum value of the casting or the entire cost. If it still falls under the, it was a 7616, I think is the HTS for an aluminum casting. If it falls under the 7616, don't quote me on the final four, final two digits, then no, it's going to be on the overall value of it. It's not just on the aluminum within it, because the aluminum castings were covered as an underlying derivative. So again, not having gone through full HTS that came out about an hour and 20 minutes ago, the answer to that one would be on the overall casting itself and not just the aluminum. But again, though, if there's a casting that's been included as a subassembly, no, that changes because now you're under a different HTS code, and that assembly might be completely different. It may no longer even be under the covered HTS code and could likely and most likely enter into the United States that are on there as well. Should the tariffs, which are currently on pause for Canada and Mexico at 25% go into effect? Would the 25% under this? Yes. Answered that before. There's no superseding. This is a plus kind of situation. They are stackable. So this would be in addition to that as well. Also, keep in mind, going back to some of these others, I mean, these include the feed to the feed over there as well, in terms of in the fees and the VAT and the other issues that are going on there. If from China, steel content 25% or 60%. If it comes in as steel, it's 25%. If it comes in as a product that is on the two lists, so there's two lists. One list is the 301. If you're on that and it's a steel product, it's 35%. If it's also on the 232 list, which almost positive it is, that's how you get to the 60. So if you are bringing in steel, not steel content, but steel, that's 60. If you're bringing in a steel containing good and it falls on list 1, 2, or 3, that's at 35. If it's a list 4A, that's 17.5. If it's not on a list at all, that's on a that's just a flat 10% that's on there as well. Question came in related to another example that I'm again, all as I know better not to speak in hypotheticals. If in the example you just gave about the China part with the metal, if the metal, let's call it, if the steel is on the derivatives list, is it subject to 25%? with the 10% apply on the balance of the assembly value. So I confused myself on that one. So if so you get the China part with the metal. If the metal is on the derivatives list, yeah, if the metal itself would be on the underlying, the derivatives of the metal would be what's subject out there. So you can't really look at it as the steel within every single product coming in is subject to a 25%. That steel within a product is only a covered good if the derivative itself is added on. So this is not a de facto all goods coming into the United States containing steel are subject. No, that is not what they said. You have to be on that derivatives list in order to be on there as well. Um, so as well, yeah, prepayment answered that one. We purchase raw material domestically, but alloys associated with Canada, we intern manufacture product and ship to our customers. Where will tariffs impact you? Well, tariffs are going to impact you, and this is where Paul's really good. Even you can say that you purchase domestically all day you want, and this isn't going to impact you, and then you're going to realize this is capitalism. And Paul just talked about the Wall Street Journal. And so even if you're not importing anything, you're dealing with a captive market. And so you are going to see the price of steel and potentially the availability markets shift, and you're going to have to deal with those fluctuations there as well. You also want to keep in mind that if this does go through, and this is a big if, folks, we're not there yet. We're not to March 12th. We can't give you advice on what to do with your customers right now and your suppliers, but there's still some time to go between now and then. But what if Canada retaliates and these do go into effect? So now you're talking about parts that are moving across the border multiple times being affected and being impacted, in addition to what's still pending to go into effect on March 4th. So there's several levels here as well that are going there. Um, is the cost of steel, okay, I think I added that one already. This last one, I'd really ask Paul to come in, and I don't know if we've got the ability, Christy, to unmute, or maybe Paul, I can try to it. I'm happy to invite one of our colleagues to jump on. What can we do to help? Just a quick set you up, Paul, on some of our strategies, what we've been advised. I sat next to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee yesterday at a fundraising lunch, was I donate to him. On Wednesday, or on Tuesday rather, I sat across from the chairman of the Education, or excuse me, of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He's from Kentucky. He's a die caster. He comes from die casting family in Bowling Green, and they both cracked the exact same joke to us. He said Donald Trump told us this week that his four favorite things in life: God, country, family, and tariffs, but not necessarily in that order. So the message that I was given directly by the chairman sitting next to him is, you better not be going in there and saying absolutely no to tariffs. You do that, you're going to be right in the doghouse and he's going to double down on you. So what can we do? It's about that message. And I think explaining to the media, getting the message out to elected officials of the role that you play and the metal of what you use it. You're not that much different. So we have a nuanced approach that I and our team have to take with our direct talks with the White House. But Jeff Asnavorian, appreciate you unmuting. If you can jump in, this is impacting a lot of our members, and we absolutely need please, more engagement, especially with media volunteers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everybody. This is Jeff Adnavorian from Clips and Clamps Industries, uh, PMA member and One Voice member. I am sure there's at least 100 of us on this call. I don't see that the guys running the webinar do, but um, these guys need help from us. We need to work with them, develop the nuanced message that we can tell at this point. And I think that has something to do with making sure the derivatives list gets populated correctly, quickly, and effectively for us. If tariffs are the president's one of the president's favorite words, then we need to support that from making sure that the downstream industries, such as all of us, are protected. And it's going to take more than 6 or 7 of us volunteering for media inquiries and stuff like that. We're going to need 20 or 30 of us. If I can be of any help to any one of our members, it's not hard. Uh, Paul and the team at Bracewell can prep you to make sure you do not stick your foot in your mouth when you are talking with a reporter. Um, we need to do this. I'm going to use a term that's gone back with the One Voice team for a long, long time. We are being put on the menu right now, guys. it's time to get a seat at the table instead of being on the menu. The only way to do that is to engage.
Thanks, Jeff. I second that, and you have been great in volunteering to speak to the media. I don't know if Tim Zimmerman is on here, but he has been great. We need to get our voices out, and this derivatives process, while the original list doesn't seem to, I know Omar answered that question, doesn't seem to be political or that it was driven by anybody lobbying. This, just like the exclusion process, the derivatives, getting the derivatives on there, our voice is going to need to be heard. And I talk to reporters all the time, and I do have a bit of a platform with our coalition of American metal manufacturers and users, but they want to talk to actual manufacturers. We'll get on the phone and we'll prep you. We send out the media inquiry to a list that's BCC to everybody. And if you don't want to reply, that's fine. But we could use more than about a half dozen volunteers that we have now, and try to get a diverse group of manufacturers speaking to the media from across the country and in different industries. And we'll send this around. Both NTMA and PMA have media volunteer forms, and we do appreciate your participation.
Yeah, please sign up. We've had, Mark Vaughn from NTMA has been really, really good with the media. He's testified here in DC on this. So it's both associations at the leadership level have been great, but to Paul and to Jeff's point, you've really got 5 or 6 folks that's just being quoted over and over again, and we have to get a little bit broader than that. And we have a very, very short timeline in order to do that. So please help us, help you is the message here. I know we're heading over a little bit. We're happy to wrap it up. How do you sign up to help out with such things? We will make sure that we've got a media volunteer link that does go out to the memberships from both PMA and NTMA, as Paul said. So I appreciate folks for jumping in there. And thanks, Jeff, for last minute. We'll be willing to come on here.
Shout out also to Tracy Scupian from Tompkins, who has been talking to reporters about aluminum. So greatly appreciate that.
All right. Any other last minute questions? You see our info, how to go over here. We're just a few minutes over. I hate to say this will be our last emergency tariff trade webinar, but I'm not going to say that since I have a feeling it won't be. But please do tune in. We'll be having a podcast here shortly, and we do have our monthly webinars. Our next one will be on Friday, February 28th at noon Eastern, and that'll cover a whole host of regulatory issues and the latest from Capitol Hill on taxes and all that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As always, please reach out whenever you need anything.